The pen felt like a small, deliberate betrayal. Maya found it at the very bottom of her handbag, wrapped in a tissue like it had wanted to be discovered. She'd been rifling through the bag in the taxi, searching for her keys, when the glove-soft weight slid between her fingers. A black fountain pen with a narrow silver clip, the nib faintly stained the color of ink that had once been furious and then patient. It was ordinary in a way that made it impossible to ignore. There was a faint scratch near the cap, an initial, almost invisible. She did not know any E by the time she reached the apartment. Her hands had learned the nervous habits of someone carrying a surprise that might be good or terrible. She unwrapped the tissue with the care you give an old photograph. The pen smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and paper. On the cap, in a looping, hurried hand, someone had written the words she would find herself chasing. I love you. Not on a card, not on a message. It was scrawled across the cap itself, the letters cramped and personal, as if the pen had been made a messenger and the world was small enough to bear such a confession. Maya told herself it must be a prank, a misplacement, a mix-up at the cafe where she'd been that morning. Maybe someone had absent-mindedly shoved the pen into her bag while they both reached for sugar. She pictured, absurdly, a room full of lovers arranging objects into secret landscapes, trying to nudge each other into noticing. Still, her pulse quickened, not with the thrill of a possibility, but with a question that branched into other questions. Why had someone used her bag? Why had they written I love you in ink instead of saying it? Who had written on a pen like a vow and then let it go? The pen became the axis of a day that had felt routine until then. The office was the same as always. Fluorescent light, humming HVAC, faces flattened by the same deadlines. But now the pen's presence made everything crack. She answered emails and sat through meetings, but her hands kept finding the tissue packet and the slight metallic weight inside. She drew it out and traced the scratch with the pad of a thumb. The letter sat like an emblem of an entire life she hadn't been living, careful, precise, private. That night she cleaned the nib, wiped off the stained ink, and uncapped the pen. A thin blue line bled into the white of a practice notebook on her coffee table. She wrote, without thinking, the name she did not know. The slanted strokes felt foreign. The next morning, the city smelled of rain, and the notebook lay open beside her bed. The same looped I love you, repeated in different sizes, different pressures, as if the pen had been warming up, trying words that might soften whatever had hardened the hand that held it. Between the phrases, an address, no, not an address. Initials, a date, a smudge that looked like a fingerprint. She did not tell anyone. The pen had become a private thing, a tiny, intrusive promise. But it did not belong to her. And if it did not belong to her, then perhaps it belonged to someone who had thought enough about her to put his unspoken confession into her world. At 10 o'clock, an email arrived that changed everything. The company she worked for had been sold. The buyer was Eaton Ridge, E. Ridge. Maya read the name 3 times before the pen's initial stopped being coincidence and started to look like a map. Her chest tightened with an old, cautious currency she recognized. Curiosity measured in dread. She tucked the pen back into her bag, where it did not belong, and understood that her life had tilted. Somewhere between the grocery lists and the invoices, someone had been practicing a dangerous language, the language of undoing. The question at the center of the day was no longer whether she wanted to find out who owned the pen, but whether she could afford not to. She did not know that the pen was the smallest of breadcrumbs, and that following it would lead her into rooms she had locked long ago, and across the clean surface of a man's life that looked like a fortress until it began to crumble, inscribed with the same looping hand. I love you. Maya Rahman, 32, edited a lifestyle magazine that published listicles and honest essays with the same nervous faith. She rented a small top-floor apartment in a neighborhood that smelled of coffee and laundry. Most days, her life was methodical. She had little faith in the romantic leaps her friends liked to make. She believed in deadlines, in clarity of brief, in the quiet victory of copy that ran without typo. Her world was measured in layouts and metrics, circulation, click-through, an occasional feature that had real heart. She was acutely, silently proud of the small things she fixed. She had no patience for theatrics. There was, under that pragmatic surface, a hollow shaped by a long-ago betrayal. Her first love, Amer, had left without explanation when he took a job abroad. She had convinced herself for years it had been a mutual drift, the slow dying of a thing that had once seemed blessed. The truth was worse. He had disappeared because he had been attracted to escape more than to her. The knowledge had hardened her. She kept lovers at a careful distance and treated attachment like delicate stationery, useful only when folded and filed. Maya had other scars people couldn't read. An unreliable father who had loved her through absences and small rages. A younger sister, Leela, who called at night with a sugar-glossed sincerity that made Maya both protective and weary. She did not talk much about the past. She preferred to make the present predictable. Her apartment was a curated list of items: thrifted chairs, a stack of paperbacks, a whiteboard calendar that carried the seasons like a ledger. She enjoyed being in control. Ethan Ridge, E. Ridge, was not the man she had expected her life to intersect with. He was 40, the kind of executive people wrote profiles about. Tidy jaw, controlled laugh, a reputation that smelled of oak-paneled meeting rooms and carefully framed accolades. He had built Eaton Ridge in under a decade from a small digital startup into a conglomerate that bought companies with the gentle certainty of gravity. He had been on the cover of trade magazines with a photo that made his eyes look softer than his decisions. Those eyes, the press had said, could be unreadable. He lived inside a reputation that read as elegant ruthlessness. As a CEO, he was known for making quick decisions and for keeping his private life untraceable. He rarely gave interviews that went off script. He loved his boat, his minimal apartment, and the order of things. People said Ethan had no time for half measures. If he fell, it was always straight and fast. Ethan's flaw, what he kept from most people, was his habit of responding to emptiness by constructing walls. He had been trained by a childhood of compromise. He learned to protect himself by deciding first, before feelings could, what he would be. Women described him as magnetic and unknowable. Colleagues described him as painfully reliable and occasionally infuriatingly distant. There was a rumor that a marriage had ended a few years ago, but Ethan's statements were polite and concise. He had not offered anyone the messy story. Their worlds were parallel, like two tracks that had run beside each other for years without touching. Maya's measured, domestic, built from small truths. Ethan's curated, public, a monument to choices made to avoid being vulnerable. He appreciated precision. She lived inside nuance. Each believed they had little to learn from the other. The first obvious point of conflict was the company acquisition notice. Eaton Ridge had bought the smaller lifestyle publisher where Maya worked. It meant reorganization, possible layoffs, and toxic meetings with HR. For Maya, it meant a risk to her job and the possible collapse of a small ecosystem she loved. For Ethan, it was a calculated move in an acquisition strategy that would tighten Eaton Ridge's hold on content distribution. But beneath that business friction, there was a more fragile current. Maya was not looking for love. Ethan did not look for anything his plan did not include. Yet both harbored internal gaps. Maya's old ghost of abandonment and Ethan's custom-made fortresses against tenderness. The pen in Maya's handbag bridged those gaps with a single, bewildering human act, the writing of "I love you." That act suggested a man who chose words in private and discarded them in public, or a man who practiced the confession before daring to make it real. It suggested that Ethan, known for restraint, might have an interior life that contradicted his public self. Or it suggested someone else entirely, someone with E initials, a lover with a messy heart. Maya's instinct was to solve puzzles. Ethan's instinct, if he had one that involved people as opposed to problems, would be to control narratives through silence. The secondary cast: Leela, Maya's younger sister, bright with reckless compassion and blunt honesty. Farah, Maya's best friend and art teacher, who could read a person's temper from the curve of their handwriting. Jonah, a colleague who masked his shyness with a habit of making coffee for everyone. Each would play a role in pulling at the pen's thread, offering interpretations, gossip, and the occasional warning. Maya's immediate goal was practical and small: keep her job, navigate the acquisition, protect her magazine's voice. Ethan's was corporate: harmonize Eaton Ridge's assets and increase market share. Emotionally, both were making decisions from breach. Maya from the fear of being left, Ethan from the fear of letting someone get close enough to hurt him. That's the terrain where complications form, where a pen and a sentence can tilt careers, reputations, and hearts. What neither could predict was how a small inked promise would become the map that led them into rooms they had sealed from each other for years. The acquisition announcement had the pleasant vileness of corporate diplomacy. Ethan Ridge sent an email at 9:07 am, concise, polished, and brimming with bullish optimism. The header read, Eaton Ridge and Ember Collective, a strategic union. The press release said nothing about people. It spoke only of synergies and content verticals. Maya read it aloud to the editorial team in the cramped conference room. Her voice was steady because she had practiced neutrality for years. Inside, her stomach was a cold stone. She walked into Ethan's name like walking into a room where the lights had already been turned on. He would be at the center of it, Ethan Ridge, a name that now carried the private initial on the pen she had found. If coincidence were a rolled-up coin, this one felt spent. 2 days after the announcement, Eden Ridge sent representatives for a transition meeting. They were polite, sharply dressed, and too deliberate in their kindness. The man assigned to their integration was a thin-lipped operations director named Marcus, who kept checking his phone to confirm a calendar. They were to meet in a neutral space, which, in corporate terms, meant a glass-walled office with a tray of muffins. Ethan did not come. He rarely came to this level of rollout, his people said. He liked the plans drawn and boxed in neat slides. The integration would be handled by his vice president. Yet at the meeting's close, Marcus slid over one business card, a small and heavy thing with a minimalist logo. Ethan's signature office was listed below, an address in the financial district. On a cautionary whim, Maya slipped the pen into the pocket of her blazer. She told herself she was being foolish and childish. Her job felt precarious. Any leverage she had should be used to secure her team, not to chase a mystery that could be a practical joke. But the pen had started to stitch itself into the edges of her week. She heard it like a high, persistent note in a song she couldn't stop humming. The inciting incident, the first shove that tilted her steady life, happened that evening at a book fair. Maya's magazine had a small booth. She'd been signing a stack of contributors' copies when she noticed the man across the aisle. He had the sort of presence that people turned away from, the way one turns away from a painting with too many truths. He was taller than she'd imagined from photographs, his gray coat almost clinical. He held a slim notebook and a pen. The pen, a slender black fountain pen with a silver clip, looked like the one she had found. Her heart thudded, which was ridiculous and immediate and extremely human. He looked at a list of event attendees and, after a moment, turned toward her table. He acted like a man with a reason. He paused at the booth and said, "Is this Ember Collective?" Maya answered, "It is." He introduced himself in a voice so composed she could have mistook it for indifference. Ethan Ridge. The name did not surprise her anymore. It had lived on the top of a memo for 2 days. The man surprised her with the smallness of his smile. He was not kind. He was simply made of precise muscles that yielded only when they wanted to. "You're Maya Rahman," he said, as if he already knew. His eyes flicked to the pen in the pocket of her blazer. She felt the small weight. She told herself to be professional. She offered him a copy of the magazine because that was what one did in public spaces. He accepted with the barest of nods, and then, as if the act of accepting required an addendum, he said softly, "I noticed something in your bag." He did not mean the magazine. He meant the pen. She could have lied, said it had always been hers, a gift from some extended relative, something mundane. But the truth was faster. "I found a pen in my bag." Ethan grew quieter. "Did you?" He hesitated and then surprised her. "Did you find any notes?" She thought back to the ash-papered practice pages on her coffee table, to the looped "I love you," to the small initials and smudged date. "Some," she admitted. "A few." Ethan's face, always measured, softened in a way she hadn't expected. "You shouldn't keep things like that," he said, as if it were a medical diagnosis. "You should return them." "Return them to whom?" Maya asked, and she realized she sounded too flippant. Her heart had escalated beyond reason. He looked at the pen and then at her hand, and for an instant vulnerability flickered, a signal quickly withdrawn. "If you'd like, I can handle that. I prefer to do things directly." He offered his card. Marcus's had been careful. Ethan's was a small slab of matte black with his name printed in thin white type. He put it on the table with the flat economy of someone used to moving things along. Maya could have refused. She could have said she would mail it anonymously or hand it to Lost and Found. Instead, she took the card and felt a system inside her shift. The pen, his pen, perhaps, had opened a door she had kept locked. Once someone else acknowledged it, Maya realized she could not close it again. The inciting incident did not end at the fair. It continued in a late-night call from Leela, who had noticed her sister's pensive voice and demanded to know if she'd met someone. She gave Maya the theatrically blunt sister talk. "If that man wrote 'I love you' on a pen, find him and ask why." Later, alone, Maya slid the pen out and turned it over between her fingers. Her life had lines, work, bills, an ordered set of routines. Ethan Ridge, who could buy companies before breakfast, had walked into one of those lines and created disruption. The mysterious writing in her home, words that declared more than they explained, was a lever, and the inciting event was this. She decided, in a moment of reckless curiosity, to call the number on Ethan's card. She did not call to flirt. She did not call to beg. She called because something in her wanted clarity, and because she'd stopped trusting people who left things unsaid. Something about the combination of the acquisition and the pen insisted that she find out whether the man she'd found had placed a question into her life, and then hidden. When the voice that picked up on the other end said, "Ethan Ridge speaking," the line felt like the first board in a game laid down. The question was simple. Why a pen? Why I love you? Why the handwriting? Ethan's reply would set off the chain of events that dismantled more than a corporate merger. It would begin a reconstruction of histories. He invited her to coffee the next day. It was not an invitation in the romantic sense. It was an invitation to explain or to take back or to make something tidy. But it was also a test. And in agreeing to sit at the table with him, Maya stepped into a current that would make small confessions into something like a work of art, careful, dangerous, and intimate. They met in a cafe that tried very hard to be unremarkable. Neutral wood tables, a barista who used words like microfoam with devotional seriousness, a potted plant with leaves that drooped like a man who was trying to be patient. Ethan arrived early. He always arrived early, Marcus had said once, as if this were a quality to be mentioned in a performance review. He was more watchful in person. His hands, long, capable hands, rested folded on the table like someone waiting to reveal something at the right moment. He ordered black coffee and watched Maya like a man evaluating a book. He didn't look at the pen. They had both left it in their respective pockets, as if that would make the conversation more neutral. "Thank you for coming," he said, with the undramatic tone of someone who did not want to overstate an encounter. Maya wanted to ask why he used a pen to write personal declarations, why he used ink to confess a thing as slippery as love. Instead, she asked about the acquisition. It was safer to test the waters. Ethan explained the business case with the practiced warmth of someone who could translate numbers into moral certainties. He played the gentle executive. "We're not trying to kill anything. We want to build what you already have." His vocabulary smoothed the edges of her fears, but when she asked about the pen, his face changed. He did not deny it. "That pen is mine," he said. "It's been with me through a lot." "Why write on it?" Maya asked, surprising herself with how steady her voice remained. He made a small, dry sound that was almost a laugh. "I don't write on things as a habit, Maya. But there are moments when you need to fix a sentiment to an object and prove to yourself that you can, so you do it. It's not noble. It's a habit I have." "Why would that habit end up in my bag?" She let the question sit. He did not look surprised. "I don't know. I can't think of anyone who would put it there intentionally. It's possible someone took it as a joke. It's also possible I left it at the bookstore earlier this week, and—" The bookstore, of course. That had been where she'd been before the book fair, running her fingers along spines and not paying enough attention to life's little exchanges. It was a plausible story. It was also an evasion. A sharper question began to ache. Why had he written "I love you" on the pen at all? Was he alone in that practice? Did he write it for himself? For someone else? The confession alone was a book with pages torn out. Over the next few weeks, their lives intersected in the small ways a corporate acquisition allows. Transition meetings, emails about editorial guidelines, a directive from Marcus to harmonize content verticals. Ethan's presence at corporate briefings was minimal, but Maya found herself turning to see him in the back rows of town halls, a silhouette, a carefully neutral face. When she spoke, he listened. Outside official encounters, he was an uncomfortable companion. The way rain is uncomfortable, useful, necessary, and likely to make someone you care about miserable if you stand too long in it. He seemed drawn to making small gestures he then retracted. He would pass along meaningful data or a piece of news that mattered to her career, and then disclaim any involvement. He would set an email with a resource and let it be. He was both guardian and observer. Between them, the pen exerted pressure like a slow leak in a tire. Sometimes it pushed them together, an editorial partner needing an approval, a meeting that required style reconciliation. Sometimes it drove them apart, boardroom conflicts, an opinion piece that embarrassed Ethan because it contradicted Eaton Ridge's tone. Maya, for her part, began to watch him in ways she hadn't anticipated. He had a habit of leaving small, nearly imperceptible marks. A propensity for correcting a misplaced comma in an op-ed he'd claimed not to have read, the ability to recall a contributor's name after a single meeting, an almost tender willingness to defend the magazine's journalists against talk that would otherwise flatten them. The more she saw, the more she realized Ethan's public image, the corporate climber, did not account for these brittle private acts. He seemed to have a private code: preserve, correct, shield. A turning moment came when a leaked memo suggested Eaton Ridge might shutter a boutique vertical, an editorial program that had been one of Maya's favorite projects. The team was anxious, and morale flagged. Marcus insisted it was only a portfolio reassessment. Ethan showed up at the small editorial meeting without fanfare. He did not speak at first. He listened to the team's anxieties and then, slowly, said, "What I like about this vertical is its capacity to find truth where others don't look." He made a small, stubborn case for preserving it. His defense felt like a promise. Maya felt grateful. It also made her suspicious. Why would a CEO put himself on the low side of a company decision? Why would he care about the craft of words? In private, it emerged that Ethan had a secret. He kept a small stack of notebooks, each filled with writing in a spidery hand. Some were directions for deals, some were lists. Others were sudden, raw lines for a life he did not publicize. The notebooks smelled like paper and rain, and the sentences inside were not business plans but small confessions. He wrote to learn how to feel. He wrote to fix feelings into letters. When Maya discovered this, finding a discarded notebook in a meeting room trash she'd been clearing after a late session, she nearly felt intrusive and then oddly privileged. The notebook held an entry, a date and a list of moments he had noticed someone, simple things, like the way someone clicked a pen, the way a person's hands came up to their face when they were thinking. At the bottom of the page, there was a single line, which had been underlined twice. "I can't say this out loud." Her hand had trembled while reading. The pen in her bag felt more than ever like an invitation. She started to imagine Ethan's life past his suits, his strategic maps, a private life that tried to name things. She imagined the pen's loops written by a man who wanted the world to be less tidy. But trust is not built on curiosity alone. The tension that formed between them was not simply attraction. It was a collision of history and habit. Maya's fear, that she could be left for escape again, made her keep certain gestures brief. Ethan's fear, that by letting someone close he'd be vulnerable in a way that could disrupt his carefully built world, made him retreat when proximity threatened to thicken into attachment. Their conversations began to widen from business to boundary. Ethan began to ask questions about her childhood, about the way she slept in the middle of the night, about the small humiliations of being a woman in a newsroom. Maya answered in guarded fragments and used humor as a shield. When she told him about Amber, Ethan listened in a silence that felt like a tension. "Do you think people leave because they are made to?" he asked once, over the tail end of a meeting about subscription growth. Maya paused. Sometimes they leave because they want more than you can give, or because it's easier to be brave in a new place. She felt a sting of accusation toward herself. What about you? He shrugged. I've learned to control outcomes. People are variables. I prefer fewer. She did not expect the next admission. But sometimes you're a variable yourself. That was truth. The confession made the space between them smaller in a way that neither liked because it made each of them visible. As they navigated the friction of corporate assimilation, a private sequence of discoveries deepened the plot. Maya found slips of paper folded into the spine of returned books, her name written once in a boyish hand, then later in a more confident hand. Maya, you were here. A handwritten phrase on a coaster she'd thought was just decoration read I love you, barely legible under the rings of a coffee cup. Once, in the margins of a manuscript sent to the office for a generational essay, someone had written a revision that softened an otherwise cutting line. It was as if an invisible editor had moved through her world and made small amends. When she confronted Ethan about each of these, each breadcrumb, he had plausible explanations. He'd been at the bookstore for a speaking engagement. He'd been present for a meeting where the coaster might have been used. He was careful and offered verifiable facts. If he was lying, he was doing it with such art that it felt as lonely as truth. At night, Maya turned the pen over and over in her hands and thought of how someone used a tiny instrument to attempt to translate a complicated, scary thing. Feeling. The repeated I love yous could be practice, a rehearsal, or an act of desperate hope. But there were darker possibilities. Someone might be playing with her life, or with Ethan's. Trust moved with more friction than she expected. She tried to test him with small experiments, arranging for Jonah to ask about his childhood, letting Farah mention a story in passing to see how Ethan responded, attempts to catch his real face where it might slip. Sometimes he failed the tests, sometimes he passed with a quiet dignity that disarmed her, and always under the tests was the corporate pressure. Marcus circulated memos that threaded a needle of fear into the staff. Reorganizations, layoffs, and new performance metrics. An editor with an anxious jaw left the company quietly. Maya's team grew smaller. Ethan showed up at the wrong moments and at the right ones, and his seeming unpredictability became a new worry for the staff. Did the CEO favor certain projects and not others? Was he manipulating the editorial voice to fit Eaton Ridge's algorithmic models? When a piece Maya had championed was edited into a near-meaningless listicle for distribution, she found herself furious in a way that did not only feel like professional pride, but like a personal violation. She demanded an explanation from Marcus, and quietly laid the grievance in Ethan's inbox with the single line, "You said you would protect this." Ethan replied with a single paragraph that read as both apology and defense. He said he had been overruled by the board in one instance and that he was working on a solution. "I never wanted to strip your voice," he wrote. "You have my word that I will fight for the work I value." Promises in email are light. Yet something about his language, that precise, improbable reaching, made Maya want to believe him. She wanted to trust that he would fight not because she was asking, but because he had found a reason to care. As the days lengthened, a rumor began to wind through the office. Ethan Ridge had remarried once and divorced. No scandal, only private choices. The rumor looped into the Penn's story. If he had loved before and lost, would that give weight to the I love yous? Perhaps he had learned too late how to hold on to people. Maybe the Penn's words were practice for a return, or maybe the words were not for her at all. One night, in a fit of exhaustion and a desperate need for a trace, Maya followed a hunch. She drove to the bookstore where she'd first suspected the pen might have been left. It was closed, its windows dark and cool. On the sidewalk, under an orange street lamp, lay a scrap of paper the size of a playing card. On it, in a hurried hand, the line she had learned to both fear and long for, "I love you." She picked it up and realized, in the small reflection of streetlight, that the handwriting matched the pen's cap. The scrap was recent. The water stain at the edge was not yet dry. She did not know whether to call the man who had acquired her company, who had placed himself like a fixture into her week, or to leave the note alone and let whatever story it belonged to remain in the dark. She carried it home, weightless and terrible. Over the next several days, the rising action of their acquaintance quickened into confrontation. The office rumor mill spun. A small scandal, an anonymous op-ed about consolidation in media, circulated, an angry voice that accused Eaton Ridge of swallowing independent voices. Marcus sought culprits. Fingers turned lazily toward the editorial team's leadership. Maya's email inbox filled with internal threats and defensive notes. Ethan requested a closed-door meeting. When she arrived, she found not a corporate confrontation, but a man unmoored enough to confess something small but consequential. He had been writing the words because he had been trying to remember how to say them out loud. He had marked the pen as if it were a talisman for the courage he did not have. "But why put it in my bag?" she asked, the question raw with accusation. He exhaled, and for the first time it was visible. This man who orchestrated takeovers was brittle and human. "Maybe I wanted you to find it," he said in a voice so low she had to lean in. "Maybe I wanted to see what you would do when you had my confession in your hands." She wanted to ask whether this was romantic, manipulative, or simply insane. She wanted to stand up and walk out, but she also, against her better judgment, wanted to hear the rest. Ethan said carefully, "I don't expect anything. I don't arrange the world like that. I have been practicing. I write because language helps me understand myself. I wrote on the pen because I thought if I committed it physically, I might actually mean it." The confession should have been grander, more theatrical. Instead, it was the honest blur of a man trying, in the quiet spaces where power often hollowed out tenderness, to teach himself to feel. It was, in its way, devastating. And despite the alarms that blinked in the office and the quiet, monstrous fear in her chest about being set up or toyed with, Maya felt a stir of something unfamiliar: recognition. She had walls sculpted from disappointment. He had walls built from decisions. Between them, the pen and its looping "I love you" became both an accusation and a bridge. They had moved past curiosity and into the tender territory where people must choose whether to trust the evidence of a heart or the architecture of a reputation. By the time the op-ed controversy reached the front pages of industry blogs, the office wore an electric tension. Anonymous comments accused Eaton Ridge of cultural imperialism. The staff, already reduced, felt the strain of public scrutiny. Marcus called for an urgent all-hands meeting that felt less like crisis moderation and more like a search for a scapegoat. Maya found herself as a possible center of blame. Someone had sent the op-ed with an ember from her email. She knew she had not sent it, but evidence, as the team joked now bitterly, could be manufactured. The thought that it might come from within the editorial team sat with the same coldness as a draft under a door. Ethan's response was a study in controlled fury. He stood before the team and defended the magazine with a ferocity that read as both corporate strategy and personal allegiance. His voice, usually controlled, had texture. He said plainly that the publication had integrity, that the editorial team deserved space to push and to be messy. He promised an investigation and vowed to protect those who told the truth. Maya felt a prick of gratitude. But the gratitude was undermined by an event that would split the room. An article leaked to a rival outlet suggested Ethan had privately requested edits to soften a critical piece about a business partner, a revelation that contradicted his public defense. The timing felt orchestrated. Someone whispered, "Compromise." No one knew the full facts. The internet did what it does best. It amplified, compressed, and made rumor into news. Marcus, sweating and alarmed, needed answers. The board wanted a quick solution. The editorial team wanted a defense that would not compromise their voice. At the center of this chaos was Ethan, and beside him, the pen's existence clustered around both him and Maya like a question. Who were you protecting, and why? The personal had become a political arena for them both. One evening, after the office had emptied and the lights had dimmed to the sickly blue of emergency exit signs, Maya received a single message from Ethan. "I can explain. Meet me on the roof." She climbed the stairs with the restless focus of someone who had decided to attend a reckoning. The rooftop smelled of rain. The city glittered and smelled of 100 indifferent lives. Ethan was already there, the city like a low chorus behind him. He looked different than he did under office lights. His face was not the same mask as before. It had been worn down and reassembled. He had the pen in his hand. "You should not have to be this," he said, handing her the pen. "What is this, Ethan? A public performance? A confession framed as an acquisition?" Her voice tipped with anger and fear and the exhaustion of someone who had been pushed against a wall. He did not flinch. He looked at her with a kind of painful purpose. "I'm sorry. Not for the pen, never for the pen. For the way I let things be decided without thinking about the people who did them. For the notebooks and for being opaque. I thought I could fix the world by moving pieces, but I couldn't fix what I didn't let myself feel." Maya wanted to counter with logic. Instead, she asked the only question that mattered in the gap. "Then why me? Why put this in my bag?" He inhaled the city air and let it out. "Because you were the person who would notice. Not because you care about me, but because you care about the thing we both love. You read for truth. I thought stupidly that if you found the pen you might find what I was trying not to ruin." She laughed, a small, sharp sound that tasted of anger. "You think placing your confession in my bag is the same as not ruining it. You've orchestrated something I can't even call a favor." He did not argue. "No, I was trying to make myself honest. If that makes me manipulative, then I accept it." He stepped closer. His voice was suddenly an intimate thing. "But you must know, Maya, when I wrote I love you, I was practicing the shape of a sentence I had never let myself speak. The pen was a talisman. I did it in the privacy of my notebooks, and then, in an absurd act, I wrote it and, perhaps as a test for myself or as a foolish hope, I left it where you might see." She felt the tension in her chest. "People don't get to be practice for other people's courage," she said. "People aren't warm-ups." "I know," he said, "and if that's how it looks, then I have failed." He said something then that pushed past both of their defenses. "I used control to survive, Maya. I learned to decide first so I wouldn't be knocked around by what I couldn't handle. That created a life that looks successful but feels hollow. When I saw your work, the way you argued for nuance and for imperfect truth, I felt jealous. You lived inside meaningful chaos. I wanted that. Writing I love you, ridiculous, I know, was my way of testing whether I could commit to saying things without a spreadsheet." She wanted to be angry. She wanted to ask for receipts, for records, for proof that his words were not a convenient soundbite. Instead, she felt the unexpected heaviness of the man in front of her, that he had been lonely in a way that left a residue on the people who worked for him. "You hurt my team by deciding publicly on business without being honest about what you wanted privately," she told him. "People will lose jobs. People will feel abandoned." He nodded. "And I'll live with that. But I don't want my decisions to be interpreted as the shape of my heart. They are separate mistakes, the mistakes of a CEO and the private failures of a man." Her voice broke for an instant. "How do I know the I love you wasn't for someone else? How do I know I'm not the end of a manipulation?" He took a breath, and the city seemed to hold. "You don't," he said simply. "You don't know. All I can offer is truth. I wrote that because I was trying to mean it. You don't have to accept it. You don't have to trust it. I only ask that you let me be honest and see what comes from that." The confession was neither grand nor cinematic. It was the small, blunt thing of a person who had decided to stand naked before another and say, truthfully, "I am trying to change." The problem with truth is that it requires you to accept the person it comes from and all the ways that person has failed you. Maya felt the truth like a rebuke and a balm. Her first impulse was to push him away. Her second impulse, less a choice than an instinct, was to recognize that both of them had been practicing bravery in separate rooms. They spoke into the wind for a long time. He explained his notebooks, the pen's habit, the private rituals he used to learn emotion. She told him about Amber, about the hollow left when someone leaves without explanation, and how that shaped her less as a woman and more as an editor who made small, deliberate repairs to human stories. They traded admissions, small, sharp things about their failures and the reasons they built walls. And then the climax happened in a way neither had scripted. Ethan told her a story that made her breath stop. Before founding Eaton Ridge, he had been engaged once to a woman named Grace, photographs of whom rarely appeared in press kits. She had been a writer. The engagement had ended not with a scandal but a disappearance. Grace had walked away, leaving behind a note that read simply, "I cannot become what you want me to be." She had left him because the life he wanted required a level of certainty, and he had been trying to marry certainty instead of people. Maya felt dizzy. The story was, in its bones, not unlike her own. The symmetry between a man who had been left and a woman who had also been left created a silence that felt less like coincidence and more like fate. "You see why I wrote the words," he said softly. "Because once you've been left, you become terrified of leaving. The I love you was a way to learn how to say it without fleeing. It was small. It was private. Then it got messy." She understood the small cruelty of being someone's rehearsal. "So who's Grace?" He looked away. "She's someone I lost. She taught me a thing I haven't learned, how to let things be untidy." "You could have asked her back," Maya said. "I couldn't fix it. I could not make myself less of a person who decides for others instead of with them." He ran a hand through his hair. "I keep making the executive decision because I fear the alternative is chaos. I was trying to fix that by forcing myself to experience honesty." It was then, at the peak of the emotional momentum, that a phone on the rooftop vibrated. Marcus's name flashed. He looked at the screen, at the city, at Maya, and something in him hardened. "What is it?" she asked. He read the message and a single color of panic crossed his face. "It's an article. Someone has tied this whole notepen story to Eaton Ridge's insider edits. They're claiming the I love you was a ploy to distract." The world narrowed. Suddenly, their private truth had become the lever used to threaten his corporate credibility. The stakes were no longer intimate alone, they were public and dangerous. Maya stepped back. "So you staged it to distract the press from something else?" she demanded, accusation glinting. He looked at her with a hopeless frankness. "No, that's the thing, I didn't stage anything. But the story, your story, my pen, will be used if people need something to drive scandal." They stood under the city lights, two people whose personal histories had intersected and whose private confessions were now potential headlines. The climax was not a dramatic public declaration, but a decision. Ethan could run to the board and try to explain his private acts, exposing himself to corporate risk, or he could hide, preserve the company, and risk the moral cost. Maya had to decide whether to believe him as a man trying to change or suspect orchestration. She felt the urgency of the newsroom, the anxieties of her staff. She felt the hollow of someone who had once been left and the fragile courage of a man trying to say the words. In that instant, the choice she made would define not only their relationship, but the careers of people who trusted her. She inhaled until the city blurred around the edges. Then she said, with the steadiness of someone who had repaired many stories, "Tell the board. Tell them everything. It might hurt, but hiding will make it worse. If you want to be honest, do it thoroughly." His face was ashen, but he nodded. The phone vibrated again like a countdown. Ethan Ridge went down to the board the next morning and did what he had rarely done in public. He told a personal truth and tied it to a corporate responsibility. He explained the notebooks, the pen, the I love you, and most importantly, the ways in which he had allowed decisions to flatten people. He said there would be time to investigate the edits, but that he would not hide behind silence. It was a dangerous gambit. It could cost him his job. It could cost the editorial team theirs. It could also, in the unpleasant geometry of corporate life, become a scandal that consumed everything. Maya watched from the back of the room. She watched a man unspool the private parts of himself like ribbon. She felt exposed and oddly reverent. The climax was not in the admission, but in the risk of a man choosing honesty in a world built upon control. When he finished, the board sat in stunned silence. Some nodded curtly. Others looked at the floor. Marcus watched like a man who had been unhorsed. The op-ed's author remained unknown, and the press, always hungry, would have its way. But a moment had been changed. A man had chosen truth, and that choice had costs. Maya realized, with a shock she could not fully name, that she wanted to see where his honesty might lead. If he was earnest, then perhaps both of them could practice something like tenderness. If he was not, the fallout would be terrible. Either way, the truth had shifted the landscape. The rooftop moment, Ethan handing her the pen, the confession, the boardroom admission, had dismantled certain safe assumptions. It had also created a new risk, intimacy, newly expensive and painfully real. The aftermath resembled a weather system after a storm. There was debris, public criticism, opportunistic headlines, an anxious HR department, and there was clarity where once there had been fog. Ethan's admission had been both a wound and a salve. The board had met in emergency and in careful subcommittees. Marcus had resigned, claiming he had been scapegoated. Nobody believed the story of scapegoating entirely. The investigation into the edits continued. But for the time being, Ethan's willingness to be transparent had diverted the tide of rumor into a longer, more sober scrutiny. At work, Maya navigated the delicate web between professional duty and a private knowledge that she had helped precipitate the crisis. Her colleagues were angry and grateful in turns. Angry at the upheaval and grateful for a leader who had at least stated, publicly, that there would be accountability. She worked longer hours and slept in short, efficient bursts. She mediated between editors and executives, a diplomat in a newsroom suddenly cast as a battlefield. Ethan, for his part, learned that honesty is a practice, not an instant conversion. He began meeting with employees, not to make speeches, but to listen. His notebook habit continued but took a new direction. Instead of private rehearsals, he began to ask questions, to learn about people's lives beyond their metrics. He did not always get it right. Sometimes his attempts to be sincere came off clumsy. He bought pastries for the staff and mispronounced the name of the pastry shop owner. He left thoughtful notes for a contributor who had been the target of the anonymous op-ed. He flinched when someone suggested a charity giving plan, but he showed up. There were practical costs. Some roles were eliminated as Eaton Ridge reorganized. The mix of anger and relief did not make loss easier. Maya sat with staff members who had been let go. She tried to be honest with the teams about what had been salvaged and what had been lost. The resolution of the external conflict would take time, but internally, something had begun to settle. Maya's own growth was less cinematic and more granular. She felt the taut line of her defenses ease. She had always believed that vulnerability was a risk. The events of the last months taught her that vulnerability could be a tool. A messy one, sure, but one that allowed people to align. She started to allow small intimacies into her life. A dinner with Farah that lasted too long, a call with Leela in which she let her sister hear fear and hope, not just scheduled cheer. Her relationship with Ethan unfolded the way careful repairs do, one suture at a time. They had arguments, but arguments that mattered rather than arguments that were performances. When she felt he was not listening, she told him. When he felt she was distant, he asked with a kind of clumsy tenderness. They practiced honesty with each other, small disclosures about their childhoods, management failures, the things they dreaded. He told her the full story about Grace, how he had loved her, and how the certainty he craved had been the wrong offering. He admitted that he had used precision to avoid pain. She told him about Amber, how his leaving had fractured a trust she had once given easily, and how her faith in being left had become an architecture of caution. She described, carefully, the places where she felt abandoned. He listened and did not try to fix everything with grand gestures. At times he failed. At times he apologized with a humility she found unexpectedly human. One of the gentlest turning points came in a small, unimportant moment. A rainy Sunday when they both found themselves at the same Saturday market, a place where vendors sold spices and odd ceramics. Ethan had misread the market etiquette and stood too close to a woman choosing peaches. She gently elbowed him and he laughed with such embarrassment that Maya felt the walls inside him shift. He offered to buy her a pastry. She accepted, and the world, momentarily, not permanently, felt ordinary. There were moments when the pen's presence was a tender joke between them. He let her keep it now, in a small velvet case he handed over like an admission of trust. She wrote her name in one of his notebooks, Maya, and then drew a small line next to it. I saw you. He wrote back, I saw you too. They moved, clumsily and with deliberation, from the space of confession to the space of care. He started to show up for things that mattered to her. A panel discussion she moderated, a donor event for a cause the magazine supported. He spoke kindly to contributors and sometimes, in private, sent articles with a note. This moved me. His offices made small changes to include editorial in more decision-making. He was not a changed man overnight. He still had habits he needed to shed. but he had chosen to be accountable out loud, and that choice had consequences that were both corrective and hopeful. The scandal that had threatened the company settled into a longer investigation. The anonymous op-ed's author remained unknown for a while. Speculations smoked like embers. When the author, a junior staffer motivated by a complex knot of fear and ideology, was identified, the company handled it with firmer, more compassionate hands than before. It was not perfect. No corporate action ever is. But there was a new precedent, acknowledgement of harm, and an attempt to remedy where possible. Maya and Ethan's relationship became, in the office and in private, a study in transparency. They set boundaries. No dates in the office, for a while, disclosure to HR, a mutual commitment to public professionalism even as they tried to build private trust. They had fights about power dynamics and about how vulnerability can be weaponized. They had conversations about how a pen and a sentence cannot replace consistent action. One evening, as spring crept toward summer, Maya walked into her apartment and found a small envelope on her kitchen table. Inside was a note folded into a tidy rectangle. It was not the pen's handwriting, but his, more practiced now, steadier. It read simply, "For the times you're brave and don't know it." Below the line, he had tucked another small piece of paper, a list of dates and times he promised to be present for certain events that were important to her. Her sister's wedding, a staff retreat, a public reading she'd be doing. He had organized himself into someone who kept small promises. Keeping promises is not dramatic. It is tedious, faithful work. Maya noticed the small acts, the way he would drop off tea if she had a late night, how he remembered the comment she had made about the photographers she liked. He showed up at Leela's wedding and awkwardly attempted to dance. He stood in the corner and applauded when Maya read a piece at a book launch. He admitted failures and asked when he should do better. They had a painful test when an old photograph of Grace resurfaced in the press, accompanied by intimate stories about their past. The tabloids tried to inflame the narrative that Ethan had saved face by staging vulnerable acts. The story's presence pulled at old wounds. Ethan was pained, public and private. But this time, instead of seeking refuge in perfection, he answered with a press statement that was human and imperfect. He acknowledged the mistakes, urged compassion, and stated clearly that the company and he would cooperate with any inquiries. Then he turned to the people around him and apologized for the ways his past had become a distraction. Maya watched this and felt something shift. She had once believed honesty could be used to break things, but now she saw honesty as a tool to forge better ones. In public, it made you vulnerable. In private, it allowed repair. Their intimacy deepened. It was not in the fireworks of plot, but in late-night conversations about mundane things, in him holding her hand in a crowded elevator, in small notes left on a pillow. "I'm trying. Please be patient." She learned to breathe around his apologies and to discern when he was performing and when he was truly changing. One afternoon at the office, a junior editor handed Maya a new piece about love and courage. It was an essay that argued that bravery doesn't require grand heroics. It resides in the slow accumulation of honest acts. Maya thought of the pen and the "I love you" looped on its cap. She thought of the notebooks and confessions. She thought of the man who had been both a perpetrator of corporate simplification and an earnest practitioner of inner work. When she read the essay aloud in the editorial meeting, she felt the shape of her own path, less linear and more layered. She recognized that she had guarded her life like a ledger, and that by doing so she had closed off certain kinds of growth. Ethan's presence had not rescued her. It had forced her to be braver in a life she had already started to live. They did not end the external problems overnight. People still lost jobs. The industry still muttered. But two people, both scarred by abandonment and the fear of chaos, had chosen to walk into the difficult work of trust. In private, months later, they sat in a small park bench and read from each other's notebooks. The pen lay between them, capped and resting in a velvet case. They traced the loops of ink like people reading a map. "I love you," he wrote in a new notebook, this time on the inside cover. It was not a spectacle. It was a line that meant he was keeping himself accountable. Maya wrote beneath it, "I see you trying." He took her hand and without fanfare replied, "Keep seeing me." They had not arrived at some cinematic ending. They had not solved every problem, but there was a new architecture, not of control but of mutual repair. They had learned that the most dangerous gifts are the ones that define another person's response, like leaving a pen in someone's bag. The safest progress required consent, patience, and an admission that change takes time. Maya kept the pen. She kept the notebook entries, his tentative lines, inside a small box. Sometimes she would pull them out and read them, seeing the slow change like rings on a tree. Sometimes the I love you would sit there like an artifact, both fragile and undeniable. This is what resolution looked like, not a cleaned-up scene but ongoing work. Some wounds closed, others scarred in more honest human ways. They had chosen to keep building. Months later, on the edge of a summer evening, Maya found the pen again. It had been polished and returned to its velvet case with the same careful reverence one uses for old letters. She turned it over and watched the light catch the tiny silver clip. The initial E that had felt like a code now looked like a footprint on a shore she had learned to walk. She remembered the first night she found it, how a small object had unraveled the thread of her days. She thought of how easy it had been to read it as a trick or a test. She thought of Ethan, of his notebooks and his careful admissions, of the times he had failed and the times he had tried. She didn't romanticize the path that had led them here. She acknowledged the messiness, the layoffs, the nights of worry, the op-eds that had cut like ice. She also recognized a truth she had been loath to accept for years. That being seen is a risk that can be repaid by being known. She had learned to separate the spectacle from the substance. The pen's I love you was no longer an accusation. It had become a record of practice. It had been written in moments when a man tried to teach himself to speak. It had been left, perhaps foolishly, in a bag where fate would find it. The story had been exploited, spun by others for headlines. But in private, the same gesture had become a seed. Standing at her kitchen window, watching the city's lights as small, honest flames, she realized she felt less afraid of being left. That fear had not disappeared. It had shifted into caution and a willingness to risk. She could not know what tomorrow held. She could only know who stood beside her now, who chose to say something real in place of silence. Ethan came into the kitchen without knocking. He smelled of coffee and rain, and something else, of the slow discipline of people who had turned confession into action. He smiled, not the impeccable smile of a press photograph, but the disheveled one of a man who had been up late and had not pretended otherwise. "You kept it," he said, nodding at the pen. "I did," she answered. "It's earned a place." He sat at the table and reached across for her hand. In his fingers was a scrap of paper folded small. He opened it and read aloud, not to perform but to share. "I love you practiced honestly." Maya felt the words both like a palliative and a promise. They were not destiny warping, they were a step. A deliberate, small movement in the direction of being less afraid. She cupped the pen in her palm and felt the faint grooves where someone had held it in moments of fear and hope. "Do you know what pen habits tell me?" she asked, half smiling. "No. That you are trying, that you are stubborn enough to practice. That you risked being seen the way I used to be afraid to." He squeezed her hand gently. "And you, what does your keeping it say to you? That I'm willing to be less neat about people. That I'll choose to believe someone is trying, not perfect. That I'll watch carefully, but I'll also let myself be surprised sometimes." They did not promise forever in that small kitchen. They promised instead to continue the work they had begun. To speak, to fail, to try again, to repair. The pen's I love you had moved from a secret into a ritual, a witness of incremental courage. As the evening folded into night, Maya looked at him and realized the most essential question had been answered not by a dramatic public reveal, but by the accumulation of small, honest acts. She kept the pen because it reminded her of that truth. Love can be written in ink and rewritten by choices. It can be practiced, imperfectly, until it no longer needs practice. They did not know what would happen next. There were no guarantees. But they had chosen, in the messy middle of lives that were busy and complicated, to be present for one another's labor, the labor of trust. The pen lay between them like a small, steady talisman. The city continued its hum, 1,000 stories moving through the night. Maya closed her fingers around the pen and, with a soft exhale, whispered, not as an ultimatum but as an offering. "Then let's practice together." Ethan's reply was a plain nod and a low, sincere line. "Yes, together." Outside, lights winked. Inside, they learned to keep speaking the sentences that were difficult to say, and to accept that sometimes the bravest work of all is simply to stay, messy, trying, and present.